I've been a global macro investor for over 50 years, and one of the biggest lessons I've learned is that some of the events that shocked me the most weren't things I had ever experienced in my lifetime, but things that had actually happened many times before in history. I first realized that back in 1971, when I was working as a clerk on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. On August 15th of that year, President Nixon went on television and announced that the U.S. dollar would no longer be tied to gold. Up until then, foreign governments could exchange dollars for gold. But Nixon closed that window and effectively devalued the dollar. At the time, I was standing on the trading floor, and I thought the market was going to crash. Instead, stocks went up a lot. I later discovered that a similar thing had happened in March of 1933, when President Roosevelt suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. That moment taught me something I've never forgotten. History repeats itself, just not always within our own lifetimes. Right now, there are three major forces at play in our lifetimes that haven't all occurred together before. I saw the beginnings of this several years ago and realized I needed to study them deeply. The first is the massive creation of debt and the printing of money to finance that debt. That process affects inflation, the value of money, and the overall functioning of the economy. The second is the internal conflict we're experiencing in the United States, disputes over wealth, values, and ideology that have become so polarized they're threatening the stability of our system. The third is the rise of a great power that is challenging the existing dominant power. In the global order it created, in other words, the rise of China. The international system we've been living in was created in 1945 after World War II, when the U.S. emerged as the dominant global power. That order is now being challenged. To really understand these dynamics, I had to go back and study the last 500 years of history because these are what I call big cycles. The rise and decline of empires and reserve currencies. That study was eye-opening. It gave me clarity about what's happening today, whether it's the war in Ukraine, economic challenges, or global power shifts. For example, I would never have anticipated the 2008 financial crisis if I hadn't studied the Great Depression. That is one of the ironies of modern life. We haven't personally lived through many of the big, painful experiences that happen repeatedly across history. Our generation hasn't endured a world war, for instance, and that lack of first-hand experience leaves us unprepared for certain risks. The harsh truth is that painful experiences are often the best teachers, and they've taught me that we need to study history if we want to understand what is coming. Today, we're entering an environment shaped by enormous debt creation and money printing. It reminds me of the transition from the 1960s into the 1970s. People tend to get comfortable in the environment they're used to. It becomes the paradigm, or the mental framework they operate within. Paradigms usually last about a decade. The 1970s were dominated by inflation. The 1980s, by contrast, were a disinflationary period. Each new decade often starts with surprises, because it tends to be the opposite of the one before it. Here's how that works. When governments create a lot of debt and money, the value of money goes down, which produces inflation. But if people don't expect inflation, they can be caught off guard. For example, many assume that holding cash is safe because it doesn't fluctuate in price. What they don't realize is that inflation quietly erodes their purchasing power. If inflation is 7% and your cash is earning 0, you're effectively losing 7% a year in real terms. That's why it's so important to help people understand how the economic environment changes, what the cause and effect relationships are, and where we stand in the cycle at any given time. That awareness can make all the difference in financial decision-making. Now, what makes a country strong and successful? I've spent a lot of time trying to answer that question systematically, by actually measuring different factors. What I found is that nations go through recurring cycles. The cycle often begins after a major reset like a war. Wars bring destruction, but the winners get to set the new rules of the system. For instance, after World War II in 1945, the U.S. and its allies established the order we've been living under ever since. In the early phase of a cycle, the fundamentals tend to be strong. There's usually a sense of unity and civility among citizens. Education improves, and education is a leading indicator of a country's future strength. When people are well-educated, cooperative, and relatively free of internal conflict, you tend to see a period of peace and prosperity. This is also because there's usually one dominant global power, which discourages other nations from starting wars. Wars, as terrible as they are, also act as great levelers. They reduce wealth gaps, wipe out debts, and create conditions for rebuilding. But as time passes and living standards rise, new challenges emerge. Wealth gaps begin to widen again. Debt levels increase, especially for countries that issue reserve currencies, because the rest of the world is willing to lend to them and hold their currency as savings. This fuels more borrowing and often encourages excesses. At the same time, new generations come along who never experienced the hardships of war. They may become complacent, less disciplined, and less committed to investing in critical areas like infrastructure, education, and other fundamentals that sustain long-term health. The result is a set of classic ingredients for decline: widening wealth gaps, growing levels of debt, and a weakening of the fundamentals. Meanwhile, other nations that were once devastated by war, think of Germany and Japan after World War II, or China, more recently recover, rebuild, and become strong competitors. The once dominant power gradually loses its edge, and global tensions rise. So when I talk about the fundamentals, I mean very basic things. Is a country earning more than it spends? Are its people educated and civil with each other? Is it productive? Is it competitive globally? Those are the core measures. If you look around the world today, you can assess which countries are healthiest by asking those questions. Nations that consistently spend more than they earn, that are divided internally, and that face rising external threats are at greater risk. Take the situation in Ukraine, for example. It is not just about Ukraine itself. It is part of a much larger story about a world that is becoming divided and no longer dominated by a single superpower. You can see the alignments forming. The US and NATO countries are backing Ukraine, while Russia has China in its corner, and other nations like India are positioning themselves carefully. It's a test case of how these global divisions will play out. Wars are rarely understood well in advance. Most people and even governments don't have a clear sense of how they'll unfold until they actually happen. But wars teach us a lot in real time. For instance, the conflict in Ukraine is showing us the true military capabilities of Russia. It's also raising questions about escalation. If Putin feels he's losing, will he turn to more extreme measures, like nuclear weapons? And is testing the effectiveness of America's sanctions. The U.S. still has one truly unique weapon: the ability to impose powerful economic sanctions. But the world is now watching to see whether sanctions alone can really change outcomes. Will they cripple Russia's economy enough to matter? Will they cause GDP to fall by, say, 10 or 12%? And if so, can Russia tolerate that? These are open questions. At the same time, sanctions have costs for the United States too. Holders of dollar-denominated assets in countries like China, India, and in the Middle East are increasingly nervous. They're asking themselves whether they might one day be targeted as well, and that fear is already affecting capital flows. So the sanctions are not just punishing Russia, they're also raising questions about the future role of the U.S. dollar. If you look back at World War II, you can actually see a very similar pattern to what's happening now. Before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. and its allies had already imposed a series of sanctions. Japan's access to oil was cut off, their assets were frozen, and they were effectively trapped economically. Those sanctions came first, and then came the military conflict. It's almost like history is reading from the same script all over again. One big difference today is how interconnected the world has become. A few hundred years ago, the farthest you could travel in a single day was maybe 25 miles. Now, you can get to the other side of the globe in less than 24 hours, and with modern communication, you can connect instantly with anyone anywhere. That's what made World War I the first truly global war, and World War II brought even greater levels of international connection. But here's the irony: greater connectivity doesn't necessarily mean fewer wars. Back before World War I, monarchies were still in charge in much of Europe, and they thought intermarriage among royal families would help prevent wars. After all, what could create stronger ties than marriage? Yet despite all those family links, they still marched straight into one of the deadliest wars in history. That tells us something important. Being connected doesn't always translate into cooperation. In fact, new kinds of connectivity like cyber connections today can even create more points of conflict. And in a world as tightly linked as ours, there are fewer places to hide if a global conflict breaks out. That makes avoiding another world war critically important. Here in the U.S., the way we're treating each other is especially concerning. If you look at the data charts and stats that I included in my book, you'll see that political polarization in America is now the greatest it has been since 1900. People are moving to different states, not just for tax reasons, but because of sharp differences in values. The divide between rich and poor has grown much deeper, and conflicts between social and economic groups are becoming more intense. When those divides get extreme, they don't just stay political, they turn into actual conflicts. We're still in the early stages, but it's beginning to look like a kind of civil war in slow motion. Once people start valuing their personal causes more than they value the system itself, the system's stability is in jeopardy. And that is where we are today, testing whether the framework of our democracy and economy can hold up under the strain of so much division. Now, let's step back and talk about the economy in simple terms. An economy is really just a series of transactions. A transaction happens when somebody buys something, whether it's a good, a service, or a financial asset. That purchase can be made with either money or credit. If you buy something with money, the transaction ends there. You don't owe anyone anything. If you buy it with credit, then you're creating debt, which means you have a future obligation to pay. So at its core, the economy is about spending, the total amount of money and credit being used to purchase goods, services, and assets. Economists often make the mistake of thinking demand is best measured in terms of the quantity of goods purchased. In reality, demand is better measured by the amount of money and credit being spent. That's what buyers are actually giving up. This naturally leads us to the credit cycle. Credit can be created out of thin air. For example, if I hire someone to paint my house and tell them, "I'll pay you later," I've just created credit. That unpaid balance counts toward GDP because it's an economic transaction, even though no money changed hands at the time. When there isn't much debt in the system, people and businesses have plenty of borrowing capacity. So you earn $100,000 a year and you don't owe anything. You could borrow another $10,000 and spend $110,000 in total. That $110,000 becomes someone else's income, which boosts economic activity. As this process continues, debt builds up faster than income. That is why credit cycles are self-reinforcing on the way up. More borrowing leads to more spending, which becomes more income, which supports even more borrowing. But debt can't rise faster than income forever. Eventually, you reach a point where it's unsustainable. That's when the cycle starts to turn. Traditionally, policymakers try to keep the cycle going by lowering interest rates. Lower rates help in three ways. They make it easier to service existing debt. They reduce the cost of buying things on credit. And they increase the present value of assets like real estate or stocks, which makes people feel wealthier and more willing to borrow. This works until interest rates hit zero. Once you're at zero, you lose that lever. When debt can no longer rise relative to income, you enter what's called a deleveraging. That's when the cycle begins to run in reverse. Spending slows down, incomes fall, and debt becomes harder to service. A deleveraging often leads to a depression, a prolonged period of economic contraction. Depressions typically involve a painful mix of austerity and debt restructuring. If there's too much debt to service, something has to give. You can transfer resources from the rich to the poor or from one country to another, like Germany bailing out Spain during Europe's debt crisis. You can impose austerity, cutting spending sharply, or you can restructure debt either by writing it down, extending repayment periods, or reducing interest rates by force. All of these methods reduce the debt burden to a level that matches the actual cash flows available to service it. But there's no painless option. Writing down debt, for example, creates a huge negative wealth effect. because one person's debt is another person's asset. If you cut a debt in half, the lender just lost half their wealth, and the ripple effects can be devastating. That's why debt restructurings are always so painful. The third option, printing money, is the one central banks always resort to eventually. By injecting money into the system, they make it easier to service debt and soften the blow of austerity or restructurings. Think about it this way. If you had a $10,000 debt that was reduced by half, the lender takes a huge hit. But if instead, the central bank adds enough money to the system to effectively cover 5% of that debt per year, over a decade, the impact is spread out and far less painful. That's why printing money ends up being part of every deleveraging process. The best outcomes come when there's a balance among these approaches, a mix of austerity, debt restructuring, wealth transfers, and money printing. Too much austerity or restructuring is deflationary. Too much printing is inflationary. But if you strike the right balance, you can have what I call a beautiful deleveraging. In a beautiful deleveraging, debt-to-income ratios come down steadily without triggering either runaway inflation or crushing depression. That's what happened in the US during the Great Depression and in Britain after World War II. The key to success is making sure the economy's nominal growth rate, that is, real growth plus inflation, is higher than the nominal interest rate on debt. If growth runs below interest costs, the debt burden compounds unsustainably. But if growth exceeds interest costs, the debt ratio gradually declines. That's why central banks always end up printing money during deleveragings. By boosting nominal growth, they tilt the balance in favor of debt sustainability. That's exactly what the US has been doing in recent years. Now, let us step into more recent history so we can see how this cycle plays out in real life. Take 2007, for example. That year marked the beginning of the global financial crisis, and it followed a very clear template that we've seen many times before. You could even trace it back through earlier International Monetary Fund restructurings. They all show the same dynamics. They're basically leveraged booms followed by busts. Once you learn the template, you can recognize it again and again. In 2007, both in the US and in Europe, debt was growing at rates that simply weren't sustainable. The most common mistake policymakers make is focusing too much on inflation and growth, while overlooking debt growth. Inflation and growth matter, of course, but if you don't pay attention to debt rising faster than income, you set the stage for disaster. What often happens is that excess debt goes into buying financial assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, rather than into productive investments. That kind of debt finance buying spree creates bubbles. And bubbles that are driven by debt are far riskier than ordinary inflation. Think back to 1929 in the United States or 1989 in Japan. Both of those were classic debt-driven bubbles that eventually burst. The same pattern showed up again in 2007. The buildup of debt was fueling asset purchases, but the income those assets could generate wasn't nearly enough to cover the rising debt service costs. That imbalance is what causes bubbles to pop. So what's the takeaway from all this? The most important thing is to get the basics right. At the individual level, that means educating your kids so they can be productive citizens, teaching them to cooperate with others, and building a society based on civility and productivity. When you have a society that works well together, respects the rule of law, and creates a healthy environment for capital markets, you build the foundation for prosperity. On a personal level, it's about living within your means. Spend less than you earn. Own more assets than liabilities. Maintain a healthy balance sheet and income statement. If most people do those basic things, stay productive, stay civil, follow the rule of law, you end up with a stable and prosperous society. Without those fundamentals, though, even the best monetary policy in the world can't save you. Let's circle back to where we are today. We are in a unique period in history because we are dealing with three major forces all at once. The first is extremely high levels of debt, which central banks are trying to manage by printing money. The second is intense domestic conflict, especially in the US, between different economic and social groups. The third is rising geopolitical rivalry, especially between the US and China. Each one of these forces on its own would be a big deal. Having all three at the same time is what makes this period extraordinary. When central banks print money, the effects ripple through financial markets in predictable ways. The Federal Reserve, for example, buys government bonds. That raises the price of those bonds, which lowers their yields. Investors then shift out of bonds into stocks and other assets in search of better returns. This pushes asset prices higher across the board. That is why you've seen such a surge in stock prices during periods of heavy money printing. It is not because the fundamentals of companies suddenly improved, it is because there is more money chasing financial assets. This dynamic also widens the wealth gap, because people who already own assets see their wealth grow, while those who don't own assets fall further behind. This widening wealth gap feeds directly into domestic conflict. When large portions of the population feel left behind, resentment builds. That resentment plays out in politics, which then spills over into markets and policymaking. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Money printing boosts asset prices, which increases inequality, which fuels political conflict, which pressures governments to print even more money to satisfy different groups. Now layer on top of that the US-China rivalry. These two countries are now the world's dominant powers economically, militarily, and technologically. Their competition touches every area from trade and supply chains to cybersecurity and capital flows. Just like past rivalries between rising and established powers, this one has the potential to reshape the entire global order. When you study history, you see that these forces, debt crises, domestic conflicts, and great power rivalries tend to show up at the same time, every 75 to 100 years or so. That is why I often say we are living through something we haven't seen in our lifetimes. But it's not unprecedented if you zoom out. The 1930s and 1940s were the last time we faced a similar convergence of forces. So how should we think about the future? One way is to picture two possible paths. On one path, countries and people handle their conflicts poorly. They fight over wealth and power, printing money recklessly and pushing the global system into chaos. On the other path, leaders and citizens get the basics right. They find ways to cooperate, they manage debt responsibly, and they maintain the rule of law. The first path leads to decline. The second path leads to renewal. What history teaches us is that nothing is guaranteed. The outcomes depend on the choices societies make. That's why getting the fundamentals right, productivity, civility, balance sheets, and rule of law is more important than any single government program or central bank policy. The future of America, and really the future of the world, hinges on whether we can get back to those basics. Looking ahead, the biggest question we all have to face is how to deal with the three forces I mentioned: debt and money printing, domestic conflict, and great power rivalry without letting them spiral out of control. It's easy to assume that policymakers have everything under control, but history shows us that they often don't. In fact, the very people making the decisions are usually trapped by the circumstances of the moment. Take central banks. They don't have unlimited freedom. They race stuck between two bad choices, allow the economy to collapse under the weight of too much debt, or print money and risk devaluing the currency. Neither choice is painless, and the longer debt problems are allowed to grow, the fewer good options there are. That's why we saw so much money printing in recent years. Policymakers chose to avoid short-term pain, even if it meant creating bigger long-term risks. The playbook is straightforward. When debt gets too high, print money to make it easier to service. But while that may delay the crisis, it also devalues the currency and redistributes wealth in ways that often fuel resentment. And this connects back to the second force, domestic conflict. When one group feels like the system is stacked against them, whether it is the wealthy versus the poor, capital owners versus workers, or one political faction versus another, it creates pressure on governments to act. Those actions often involve more spending and more debt, which leads to more printing. It's a cycle. The third force rivalry between the US and China adds even more complexity. We're already seeing tensions spill into trade, technology, and finance. For instance, restrictions on technology exports, disputes over supply chains, and battles for influence in other parts of the world are all symptoms of this rivalry. Just like in past power struggles, both sides are trying to protect their interests while testing the limits of the other's resolve. Now, the question is, where does all of this lead? The honest answer is that no one can say for sure. But by studying history, we can see the range of possibilities. On the negative side, if we mismanage debt, let domestic conflicts tear us apart, and let international rivalries escalate unchecked, we could face a very disorderly period of economic decline, political breakdown, and even the risk of major conflict. History shows that these outcomes are real possibilities. The 1930s leading into World War II are a clear example. On the positive side, if societies focus on the fundamentals productive citizens, cooperation, fiscal responsibility, and the rule of law, they can renew themselves. We've seen that too. After World War II, for instance, the U.S. rebuilt its economy, strengthened global cooperation, and created a foundation for decades of prosperity. Renewal is always possible. So the big challenge for all of us, whether as individuals, families, or nations, is to position ourselves wisely. On the individual level, that means sticking to the basics I've emphasized. Spend less than you earn. Build a healthy balance sheet. Educate yourself and your children, and contribute positively to society. Those aren't glamorous strategies, but they're timeless. On the societal level, it means demanding leadership that can rise above short-term fights and think in terms of long-term sustainability. That requires compromise, cooperation, and a focus on what unites people rather than what divides them. It also requires investing in productivity through education, innovation, and infrastructure so that growth is real, not just borrowed through debt. And globally, it means recognizing that competition between great powers doesn't have to end in conflict. There is room for rival nations to coexist if they respect boundaries and find ways to cooperate on shared challenges. But that requires careful diplomacy, mutual respect, and a commitment to avoiding the destructive patterns of the past. It is natural to feel uneasy about the future when you understand the scale of the challenges ahead. But I believe there's also room for optimism. Why? Because human ingenuity, when combined with the right fundamentals, has an incredible track record of overcoming obstacles. We've seen societies rebound from depressions, wars, and even collapses. The path forward isn't predetermined, it depends on the choices we make. For me personally, I always go back to the basics: be productive, work well with others, and maintain strong financial health. At the family level, that means teaching kids the value of education, civility, and cooperation. At the national level, it means promoting policies that encourage productivity and fairness while respecting the rule of law. And at the global level, it means avoiding unnecessary conflicts while competing in healthy and constructive ways. If we can do those things, the future doesn't have to be grim. Instead, it can be another cycle of renewal, just as past generations found ways to overcome the crises of their time. So, in summary, yes, we are living through an extraordinary period of history. Debt levels are high, money printing is rampant, domestic conflict is intense, and geopolitical rivalry is escalating. That combination is rare, and it carries risks. But history shows us that how we respond matters more than the challenges themselves. With the right fundamentals, societies can adapt, rebuild, and even thrive. Without them, decline is almost guaranteed. The choice is ours.